question today is a delusional story. How can anyone believe that Jesus rose from the dead? This lunchtime, we're thinking about the claim that Jesus of Nazareth, having been brutally killed by trained professionals, then rose bodily from the dead 3 days later. It's a claim that's been around as long as the Christian faith has been around, and if it didn't really happen, then everything we've been saying this week, everything about Jesus and about the love he offers, is false, and you should pity us. But if it did really happen, then it reinforces and underlines all of the claims that Jesus made about himself. It means he is exactly who he says he is. It means that his story is the true story, and that real hope is an option in a world that often feels so bleak. Big words for a Friday lunchtime. But I remember finding this one of the most refreshing things about the Christian faith. It didn't sit 6 feet above contradiction, invoking mystery every time evidence was sought. From the very beginning, this is what the earliest Christians pointed to as the thing that had convinced them to start following Jesus. And centuries later, I'm here to say more or less the same thing. Just speaking personally, as a skeptic, it was getting to grips with this evidence that convinced me that following Jesus was the best thing to do. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to outline some of that evidence for us. And I want to do that by thinking through 2 questions. Question 1, how do we explain the event itself? And question 2, how do we explain the explanation that the earliest Christians gave to that event and stood by, even to their cost? So firstly, how do we explain the event itself? Whatever happened in the days just after Jesus died, it requires an explanation. Because when we assess these days in history, we are dealing with something remarkable, whatever we think happened. Because people die all the time. People die violently all the time. Crucifixions were not uncommon. And in fact, we know of other candidates for Jewish Messiah who were put to death. These things happened, and after everyone, the world moved on, unchanged. Yet the days following the execution of Jesus of Nazareth were utterly different. Those days have had a deep, sweeping impact on a global scale, setting in motion massive historical change with which we live today. Now, as we investigate these days, we have the luxury of extraordinarily early testimony, from only a few years afterwards, to work with. Here's the source we're going to look at. It's from an early Christian writer called Paul, writing a letter to a Christian community in Corinth. And I'm just going to select a little bit. He wrote, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's an Aramaic name for Peter, "and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born." Now, this little passage is of tremendous value to the historian because this letter is dated to around 52 AD, which is just 20 years after the death of Jesus. However, as you can see, Paul isn't writing something original. He says that he's passing on something that he himself received, a very, very early Christian tradition. And so the majority of scholars here conclude that what we've got is an extremely early creedal formula, a dramatically early insight into the belief and practice of the early Christians. And some historians have dated it plausibly to within about 5 or 6 years of the event of Jesus' death and what happened next. Now, looking at this source and a few others, here are some key historical data we're able to isolate. 4 facts. Firstly, that Jesus was crucified, died, and then buried. Secondly, that 3 days later, early associates of Jesus claimed to have seen his tomb empty. We find this described in all 4 of the Gospel accounts. Thirdly, that in the immediate aftermath, on separate occasions and in different ways, many different witnesses claim to have met with Jesus. And then fourthly, these witnesses, despite their prior fear and cowardice, were totally changed by what they claimed happened, and became almost immediately proclaimers of this risen Christ, willing to sacrifice even their lives for this cause. Now those four facts, which is all they are what we find when we look at history. And here's my question. How do we explain the event? How do we put these four facts together? Now, I remember when I started investigating this that I was surprised that these key facts are almost unanimously held by the majority of scholars. There is some debate by a bit of a fringe minority about whether the tomb was really empty, but historians and New Testament critics of every stripe, believers and skeptics, accept these as givens. And you might think, well, why do they do that? Why do they take these religious writings seriously? Well, the reason why these facts are taken seriously is because these critics are just being fair historians. We have no good reason to dismiss the New Testament as a historical source. And we have plenty of good reasons to take it seriously. I'll just give a few of them. For one thing, you can look at the people who were put forward as witnesses. We find that the first people to encounter Jesus' empty tomb are women. That's the case in all four gospel accounts. We don't think much of that, but in the first century, that was a stunning choice. I'm sorry to say that it was a time of unchecked and unquestioning sexism. So putting them forward as the first witnesses is a very telling thing. Their testimony wasn't even accepted as serious in a court of law. And so this falls into the category of things you just wouldn't make up, because actually it made what you were saying harder to believe at the time. More than that, many of the other witnesses just aren't that impressive. When you look at the next few generations of Christian writing, you find it's falling into a genre of hagiography. That is to say, it's unrealistic, highly favourable accounts of the early Christians, lionising their bravery, accentuating their piety, and skating over negative things about them. And that makes all kinds of sense. It's really good propaganda. That's the kind of thing you would write to convince people to stick with the movement. But that's just not what you find in the New Testament. Thomas famously doubts. Peter denies Jesus the night before he dies. James, the half-brother of Jesus, is recorded in the Gospels as having thought very little of his so-called Messiah brother. And most of all, Paul, the writer of the source I just quoted from. Let me give you a little bit of background about him. He went from being a rabid anti-Christian to the most accomplished and articulate Christian representative in the first century. So what historians have found is that these texts look very little like propaganda. Not much about them seems to have been written to persuade people, but reads more like the honest recounting of those who want to say what happened, even if they didn't fully understand it then or now. And that's why we can't dismiss these writings as history, and that's why there is this consensus around those four facts. What we have to do is assess these four facts and find a coherent explanation, one that accounts for all of them, as well as the changes that we see in history. So how do you explain these facts? From the very beginning, the first Christians had an explanation that made perfect sense of what happened, and continues to do so. That Jesus of Nazareth, just as he said, rose bodily from the dead. So of course his tomb was found empty. Of course he went to meet his disciples, and of course they were changed, utterly changed by what they'd seen. Jesus rising from the dead accounts for all of that evidence. But of course, when I was investigating this, I didn't want that to be true. So I went looking for counter-explanations, and there are a few. Some people advocate a swoon theory. The idea that Jesus didn't really die, but somehow managed to survive crucifixion. And that's why he was able to empty the tomb and go meet the other disciples. Now, the problems with this are vast. The Romans were good at all kinds of things. They were good at straight roads, and they were good at cool Roman military uniform, and they were great at killing people. These are trained professionals. And John records that there was a spear put into Jesus' side, and blood and water, what looked like it, flowed out. The medics among you would say that that's a clear sign that vital processes in Jesus' body had ceased. He was dead. And there's actually another problem. Here's how a skeptic, Daniel Strauss, puts it. He wrote, "It's impossible that a being who'd stolen half dead out of a sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry." You see, if Jesus really had just survived death by crucifixion and was a battered, mutilated body, the disciples would not have looked at him and concluded, the victor over the grave. They would have thought, let's get this man to A&E, he's in trouble. Now others have said, well, maybe a stolen body explains the presence of the empty tomb. And again, the problems with this are vast. Matthew's account tells us that there was a Roman guard stationed outside the tomb, so whoever stole it had to have worked their way past it. Some suggest ordinary run-of-the-mill grave robbers, and grave robbery was a thing that happened in the ancient world. But if we choose that option, we've got a huge issue. John tells us that when they got into the tomb, what they found was that the strips of linen were left there, but Jesus' body was not. Which means that if grave robbers were there, they took the one thing that was worthless, the corpse, and left the one thing that was precious, these very expensive, very precious spices. Could you really believe that? Others have said that the disciples stole the body. Well, again, you have to explain how they managed to Metal Gear Solid their way past that guard. But then you also have to explain why so many of them say that they saw Jesus for themselves, up to 500 at one time. Where do those appearances come from? More to the point, why did these early witnesses die for something they knew for certain was a lie? Yes, of course we're familiar with people who are prepared to die for what they believe is true. But if we say the disciples stole the body, we're saying they were prepared to die, all of them, for something they knew was false. That really stretches credibility. Or maybe it wasn't the disciples, maybe the authorities in some shape or form stole the body. And that's really the most ridiculous one of all, because if they had, all they had to do to crush the early Christian movement was produce some evidence of Jesus' body. And the early Christian movement survived and even snowballed because the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, so blatant and obviously falsifiable, never was falsified. Others advance a theory of hallucination. Perhaps in their grief, the disciples were susceptible to seeing what they want to see. And again, the problems with this are vast. They knew that grief would cloud their objectivity. That might be why Thomas, famous doubting Thomas, doesn't believe at first. They really did know that dead people stayed dead. Moreover, I'm told by my medic and psychologist friends that this idea actually works against medical findings, which tell us that hallucinations occur to individuals inside their heads and are not corporate events. And even if you were to posit a never-before-seen group hallucination, you're still left with a body in the tomb with that option. None of these explanations fit the facts. So how do we explain the event itself? Every part of the evidence must be accounted for. And there is an explanation that makes sense of all of those pieces. Jesus rose again from the dead. To believe that is an act of faith, but not blind faith. It's an act of faith cutting with the grain of the evidence that we see. And rejecting the resurrection takes, to my mind, a great deal more faith, and blind faith at that. The kind of faith that I'm not sure thinking people can really live with. I think that's thrown into even sharper relief when we come to the second question. How do we explain the explanation the early Christians gave to this event? You see, the concept of resurrection, as the Christians proclaimed it, was utterly foreign to first century Greco-Roman thought, and equally foreign to Second Temple Judaism. So we need to explain where this concept of resurrection came from. In these early decades of the Christian movement, what emerges is a cogent, consistent, and thought-through doctrine of bodily resurrection, with some remarkable facets. It was extremely countercultural, insisting on a material, physical resurrection that, to the classical worldview of the day, was foolishness, and insisted that it had happened in the middle of history, which the Jewish culture in which it was proclaimed was also foolish. Now, it's very common when you study the history of ideas to see a gradual development in thinking, new ideas slowly picking up steam and being refined, things moving as slowly as glaciers. But that's not what we find here. We find an almost fully formed portrayal of a risen Jesus, with well-worked implications of that resurrection. It's not a glacier, but more like an earthquake, unlike all of the worldviews of the time exploding into being. Now, many other Christian doctrines took time to refine, centuries to articulate. And yet here we have a raft of new and compelling teachings appearing in a very, very short period of time. We find this early community coming out with these unique ideas, and it's close to incredible to believe that they manufactured it out of nothing. Just think of the different kinds of people who put their name to these ideas. Think of your best friend, your sibling if you have one, and your worst enemy. Think of the three of them and then ask, what would you have to do to convince all three that you were the Son of God, risen from the dead? And yet that's exactly what Jesus had done. Peter and James and Paul, fitting those three categories, are coming forward to say just that. And it beggars belief to think that these things were fabricated out of thin air, made up on the spot, worked out behind closed doors. The early Christians didn't have the time or the influence or the authority to come up with this concept. And that's just coming up with it. What made people believe it? What made them give up deeply held concepts, practices, and ideas so quickly, even when it meant their death? When you look at how rapidly this idea arises, how coherent it is across different writers, how quickly and widely it was adopted, a historical bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is the explanation that fits the facts. And when you think about the way that the cards were stacked against them, and the authorities never managed to quash this movement, you have to ask why. And I've yet to find an argument that really does justice to the details, apart from Jesus' bodily resurrection in history. So how do we explain the event itself? How do we explain their explanation of it? Those are my two questions, and the only answer I found vaguely satisfying is the one in which Jesus rises from the dead in history. But for the rest of our time, I want to see why this claim has such an impact on the world. What it means for us, since Jesus rose from the dead, is that hope is much more than wishful thinking. Real hope is on offer, and you can have it. And that matters because death is the hideous end of all our hopes. It mocks all that we are and strive to be. Dave Eggers, the novelist, imagined interviewing himself, and this is what he wrote. What about dignity? You will die. And when you die, you will know a profound lack of it. It's never dignified, always brutal. What's dignified about dying? It's never dignified. And in obscurity, offensive. Dignity is an affectation, cute but eccentric, like learning French or collecting scarves, and is fleeting and incredibly mercurial and subjective. So, well, if that's all we are, time and matter and chance, then death is the cold, callous annihilation of all we care about, and it reduces the things we love to nothing more than an affectation. Maybe at school you had to read Hamlet, and there in the soliloquy, Hamlet calls death the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns. He's saying, how can we know what death holds? Everyone goes there, but nobody ever comes back. Death is the great unknown, and yet at the same time, it's the great certainty. It's the leveler of levelers. You might live in a council estate, or you might live in a country estate, but you'll still die. You might be brilliant and intelligent and cultured. You might be rather thick. You'll still die. Death swallows us all up. Men and women, rich and poor, young and old, good and bad. You could never be rich enough, clever enough, strong enough, or fit enough to escape death. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then that's not true anymore. It's no longer the undiscovered country. Someone has come back, and they can show you the way out. There is a life and a love that death cannot pin down. And that life and love can be yours. Because Jesus knows how to undo death. This hope is worth resting your whole life on. Because God knows how to take something that looked like defeat and turn it into victory. take something that looked like darkness and turn it to light, take death and bring out of it life, then there's nothing he can't do. Nothing he can't fix in the end. If you're a Harry Potter fan, you'll know that James and Lily Potter, the parents, have a Bible verse on their tombstone. It's from that letter, Paul to the Corinthians, and it says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Because Jesus rose from the dead, that is true. The Bible's promise is of the God who will fix our broken world and wipe away the tears of his people, and he'll do it with nail-scarred hands. And just as he left the tomb hollow and empty, he will empty death of all of its power over us. So you can trust him. You can trust him with your life today. You can trust him with all of your fears and dreams. You may not know everything, but as you look at Jesus, you'll find that you'll know enough to trust him. And you can stake your life on this, and you will never regret it. Never be disappointed. So as I finish, and it's been so great to be with you this week, let me ask, what's stopping you from doing that? All this week we've been saying that when you look at God and ask these big questions, what you find in Jesus is not a dismissive deity who's shrinking back from your questions and your desires, but one who came to be where we are, to take a lowly and rejected place in our world of suffering and brokenness and evil. But someone whose love proved stronger than death, whose life proved too big for the grave to contain. One who is alive today, and so his risen life reinforces every offer of life and joy and blessing that he makes. As much as we have solid historical evidence when we look at Jesus' resurrection, there's so much more here. If this is true, we have reason to hope. And everything we've been saying about the life-giving, sin-forgiving, hope-filling story of Jesus is true. And it can be true for you in a way that brings life and forgiveness and hope to your story. And I would be cheating you if I didn't tell you that today, whoever you are, whatever you're like, that's an offer that's on offer to you. That your story doesn't have to end with hopelessness or despair, but your story can end with a non-fiction happily ever after. The evidence points very substantially to Jesus risen bodily from the dead in history. He offers the kind of life, love and hope that our very worst enemy, death, cannot pin down. What's stopping you from having it today? What's stopping you?